Hello, everyone, and welcome back to your daily dose of art slop content. I will be your host, Dr. Drawing, otherwise known as Professor Painting, and here today I bring you a very exciting, groundbreaking story from the hellhole of LinkedIn that I unfortunately had the displeasure of going to for some reason, where it has been brought to my attention that an artist by the name of Paul Maffayone, I think that's how you pronounce it, has been... has been using AI to polish his old images. And now, this is not the first person that I've seen do this, and this is all, of course, alleged. And it's really not the purpose of this video to rag on him, nor is it to try and give an ethical analysis of the use of AI generally, or even the use of AI specifically here. So I don't want to talk about whether it's moral or not. I want to talk about whether it makes sense practically, and we'll see very quickly that it doesn't, because it actually doesn't really do its job the way it's intended. But I think furthermore, I want to analyze this idea of polishing from a technical standpoint. So I want to sort of talk about fundamentals and actually try to learn something from this. So this is slop-utainment, where we take slop drama, we kind of stir the pot a little bit, but then we sort of flip it around and we talk about what we can learn from this. So I guess to begin with here, I want to show you the before and after, and we'll look at it close up. And I think it might actually just even be possible that he just lost like the high-res version of this file. I didn't actually look into this too deeply, like I didn't go through his portfolio and start digging around, but that's, you know, that's a possibility. He could have just lost his high-resolution file, and because he couldn't get it, he just tried using some kind of an AI software to up-res it. But again, as I already said, that doesn't really work. So here we have a before and after. This is the up-resed version, and I'm actually going to zoom out here, and we're going to turn it off to see that largely speaking, there's actually no significant change. So that already kind of tells us that the surface layer of the image, the detail and the texture, is not, at least in essence, what makes an image good. It's not what gives it quality fundamentally. It's more so the big compositional elements. So even from that standpoint, I think what is to be gained here by using AI, as you know, compared as opposed to your reputational risk that you might incur, it's really not a good risk to reward ratio here. But in any case, you can't really see it from afar. There's a tiny difference, but not significant whatsoever. Now let's look at it from up close. And so this is the original, and it has certain qualities that I think are good, but perhaps are not obviously or sort of self-evidently good. And I think a lot of people just sort of assume and intuitively feel that brushwork is good, without really getting to the bottom of why they feel this way. What is it that actually, what quality is it that brushwork gives to an image? And we could say, I guess with fair certainty, that this image does have a kind of brushwork, specifically in its separation of shapes, at least as compared to the up-resed version. So I guess effectively what the up-res does, for the most part, is just remove the shape separation. It does certain other little quirky AI things that we're all kind of used to, like messing up this texture in a really strange way, for an example, or certain smaller parts here on the shield changing very awkwardly. But again, for the most part, what happened here is almost the kind of airbrushing effect. And there's nothing inherently wrong with using soft edges. And we'll talk about all of this, of course, when we sort of go into a deeper dive. But I think, I guess colloquially speaking, we could probably all agree that, again, apart from the weird artifacting, a certain amount of freshness has been lost to this image. And the problem in some part, and this is besides the point, this is not what I'll be talking about throughout the length of the video, but the problem in some part is also just that AI is sort of incapable of understanding what things are, so he has to guess. So for example, this becomes kind of like a weird eyeball, which it wasn't, it's just the bone. So you can't rely on it because it's not actually intelligent, but again, it's been beaten to death. Why is it that it's good to have brushwork in your image? That's actually, I think, the question that this kind of poses. That's sort of what I thought about. And to describe that, or to get to the fundamental bottom of that, I want to talk about two big concepts. I want to talk about detail distribution, which relates to brushwork, because it's really the amount of small brushstrokes that you put in a certain place that determines how you distribute details. Detail needs to be made with a small brush. That's sort of inherent to detail. And then the other concept that is more abstract, and I think more interesting to actually talk about, and maybe more broadly applicable to the whole discussion of AI, is the idea of abstraction in illustration, and specifically, especially in commercial illustration, because this is what this is. This is an image made for a commercial project. It's meant to sell a product, the game, or it's meant to be an asset in the game. It's meant to be appealing, and it has certain qualities that are not inherent, for example, in fine art. So there are specific requirements, perhaps in art direction, perhaps in style, perhaps in just the very approach that we'll see in commercial art. But again, my question is, why not use AI? And the first thing is, when we look at some really good examples from Hearthstone, like these Max Crack images, it's that to describe the surface quality of a material, you have to be intentional, and you actually have to make decisions. There's decision making sort of inherent in the choices made when we render that's not replicable with a machine algorithm. And a lot of it, as I already kind of alluded to, I think comes down to how many small details you place where. And we've actually seen here in this previous example that a lot of the interesting, and I think even sort of helpful to storytelling details, like the wear of the armor, just gets completely lost. Whereas here we have that maintained. So it's a different sort of implication if this armor is pristine and crisp and completely undamaged, or if it's very weathered. And furthermore, there's going to be a range of weathering. For example, just as a small material aspect, there's going to be a range of weathering to the different materials that you have in your illustration. So for example, it's not applied to the jewelry in here, or even to some extent to the fabric, but it is applied to the armor, which makes sense. And we can see in this example here another quality that we'll start getting towards, which is the brushwork present. But more specifically, and I think this is important to qualify, when I talk about brushwork, what it is really at the bottom is just clear shape separation. It's not as if there's an attempt to replicate or create the illusion of a traditional media here. It's not like this is trying to be an oil painting, for example. It's not trying to emulate thick brushstrokes, but what it does have are these clear shapes that are present all throughout the painting. And this is sort of getting towards something more fundamental. Whereas in this example, more of what we're looking at is literal and physical. Like this is an actual material. We are showing, in a figurative sense, this object, and we want to communicate and render something about it. Here, it's more fundamental because it's applicable to essentially the whole surface of the image. And in some sense, more or less, depending on how far you stylize and how much you simplify, images are, on some level, just a kind of mosaic of shapes, which are, of course, naturally created through brushstrokes. When we paint, we make brushstrokes. The brushstrokes form shapes, and then all of the shapes, intricately put together, create the illusion, the figurative illusion of our subject matter, which the viewer suspends disbelief about and understands as believable. But this image has a lot of that clear, nice shape quality in certain areas where we would expect it, like cast shadows, which naturally produce hard edges, but then also in a lot of organic places like the face, which we all inherently understand as something quite smooth for the most part, and in the fabric as well, which we also understand as something quite smooth. So this quality then kind of deepens the image in a sense to where you're not only trying now to show the subject matter, to create the illusion of three-dimensional space and the illusion of light and shadow, which is necessary and it's inherent to any figurative art and any illustration, but you're also at the same time showing a layer sort of beneath or behind the subject matter, which is the surface of the painting. And I think this is something that's understood very subconsciously, and it's kind of implied for the viewer, but we can look into it more deeply. And I think that's, at least in part, what causes an appealing effect, or an effect of kind of freshness to an image, is that the viewer subconsciously understands, because they see interestingly designed and clearly defined shapes, they understand that this is an image. But they also at the same time understand that it's an image that represents something. So it's a kind of interesting interplay of the thing itself and then kind of a meta referral back to the fact that this is a painting. It's very abstract perhaps, and maybe I'm not doing the best job of describing it, but that's sort of the next element that I want to talk about after we look at these examples again for Hearthstone from Laurel Austin. And this is a similar type of art. It's kind of a key art dynamic scene with multiple characters. And to circle back to the idea of this detail distribution, as a compositional device, naturally, apart from using different sorts of contrast like value and color contrast, detail itself is a driver of contrast. It's a visual element that attracts attention. This is something that I think we all understand intuitively, and naturally we understand that if we include more detail, we are including more of different kinds of contrast. Small shapes naturally are separated, so they have to have different colors, and those different colors, this is kind of getting abstract, but those different colors are then what produces contrast. So whenever we add small brushstrokes, we are attracting attention, and naturally we want to then include those small brushstrokes in spots that we want the viewer to actually look at. And apart from just showing something when we make an image, we also naturally want to make sure that the viewer sees it the way we want him to see it. We want him to look at certain areas that we intend for, and we even can manipulate the order in which they look at different areas. But in any case, broadly speaking, if you look at the rendering of this image, which we'll take a look at a couple close-ups of here in a second, there is an application of detail and smaller brushstrokes in certain areas, in certain sometimes very specific areas, and then there is a looseness, or even you could say sort of vagueness applied in others. And we can see that here, and we can see that in this here image as well. If I turn this off and we look at the whole thing, this is very, very, very loose, whereas this is much less so, even though I would say it's still a pretty loose rendering, and that's why it feels fresh, that's why it feels appealing, at least in part. But looking at these sort of, I guess, areas that are not focal, you can get a little closer to an example of this kind of shape abstraction that we'll start moving towards and start talking about more and more. Where if I zoom in on this enough, yeah, we can tell what it is from afar, but from up close, and this is going to be a couple of pixels now, it's really just a combination of very few simple shapes. So that's sort of the underlying abstract layer that any illustration has, and certain styles and certain art directions will attempt to sort of divert attention from that, whereas others, especially as you get more and more towards fine art, will start pointing the viewer's attention towards that. But here are the close-ups, and we can tell again that there is detail applied to important areas, like obviously the characters as a whole. So then here, even the focal points, or I guess the areas of interest, the areas of detail, still consist of often very clearly delineated shapes that are sometimes connected by soft edges like this, whereas other background or non-focal areas have a similar sort of fundamental idea. They're made up of shapes, but the shapes are often much larger, and because of that, more apparent. And so again, if we zoom into any of these, eventually it just becomes kind of an abstract canvas, you can almost say. There's not detail here to actually, from this up close, have us understand exactly what this element is, and that's really what we're looking for. And I guess, in other words, you could say that that's the effect of a good intentional detail distributions. If you don't include details, you will end up inadvertently or otherwise abstracting certain areas. And again, it's this abstraction that I actually find the most interesting, and it's almost like this abstraction is kind of what the whole weird AI polishing discussion kind of starts pointing towards, which is kind of paradoxical, because AI abstracts in a weird sort of artifacting way that doesn't make any sense, but the artist, on the other hand, abstracts in an intentional way with brushwork. And so again, there are areas of detail, very small specific areas of detail, like the cards, which is kind of necessary for this illustration. It's about a card game, we want to include them. It's tiny detail, and it almost feels like it doesn't really fit in here. And then there are other areas like this, which if you zoom in on them to the same degree, again, just sort of feel very flat, which is typically, the term flat is typically used as a negative in image making, but in this context, in the context of brushwork and abstraction, it's actually a good thing. So I just want to show a couple more examples, really. I think I've sort of gone over everything that I wanted to talk about. It's really fundamentally about this idea of multiple layers. And if something has multiple layers, what that means is that it's not just superficial. It makes it profound. It gives it depth in a sort of meta sense. So the depth here, the depth of perception, I guess you could say, is that the viewer, even though they're not aware of it, understands that, hey, this is the artist, as they make this, they're telling me not only what this is, but also that they're telling me that it's a painting. And sometimes the artist does that subconsciously themselves, but this is clearly not what drapery, for example, looks like. It doesn't look like these abstract shapes, but we understand that it's drapery, so that's sort of where the multi-layered interest comes from. It's not the literal thing itself, it's an abstraction or a kind of filtration or a translation of the subject matter. And Sergei Klasov, as a sort of general quality, has a lot of this clear shape separation in his images. And it's kind of interesting that these are both from the same project, from Dishonored, but this is a much more tame concept art. It doesn't have, at the surface of it at least, as a kind of standout effect, it doesn't have nearly the same amount of abstraction or stylization, but if you look at them closely enough, they actually both share the same quality of simple shapes, except here the shape separation, the value control is very subtle. So again, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to look at 4 pixels here, but this is a shape that separates in much the same way as all of these other ones do, except the values are much broader. The edge perhaps is a little bit harder, but fundamentally that, at least that quality, is maintained. It's sort of what ties really this whole project, the concept art of Dishonored. That's sort of what ties it together. And interestingly, and this is perhaps a little besides the point, it's also not only perhaps, and maybe primarily, not only to point towards the image as an abstract two-dimensional surface, but it's also to point towards a more abstract quality of the subject matter that is represented, which is the planar quality that everything, if broken down, has. So again, just as we've talked about with the face that we've looked at here, has clear, distinct, sharply defined planes. We understand that most organic things, clothing, fabric included, are soft, but if we simplify them, if you sort of think about it as making it a low-res 3D model, then it starts breaking down further and further into more and more distinct and sharper planes. So there's sort of 3 levels now, and perhaps you could expand this further, and this is certainly not a strict system, but you have the thing itself that we understand as, for example, here, the character. Then we have a quality of the character being exaggerated and expressed to the viewer, communicated, that, for example, fabric is on some level, in a simplified way, planar. And then furthermore, through the application of a brushwork that is left alone, so we can sort of see how the painting is made, we're also communicating that it is a painting that we're looking at ultimately. It's actually not the character. And really, it's those 2 things at once. Again, that's what makes it interesting. But I think a very good example of this are these couple Leyendecker close-ups, and this is getting sort of further and further away from maybe the specific niche that we started from. We started from card art, from commercial illustration for cards, and now we're getting towards book cover or like magazine interior illustration. So it's sort of the same broad industry, but the other, I guess, defining or separating quality here is that this is made with oil, so it's a traditional painting, and it can show and have certain qualities that we only can really just replicate and try to copy in digital, and that is that paint actually is not fully two-dimensional. And we've gotten very far from the beginning topic of discussion, which was AI. But I think this is actually, on some level, and there's certainly other facets to this, but on some level, this is what gives quality to traditional art, is that we can tell how it's made. We can literally look at the thing itself, and we can tell, okay, it's flat. We understand that it's a canvas, so it's ultimately like, from afar, it's flat, it's two-dimensional, but from up close, it's really actually three-dimensional. It just has this very thin relief. And it's a quality, again, that in digital art you can only try to replicate, but it's a weird sort of reversal. It's like you're going, digital actually is two-dimensional, so you're creating an illusion of 3D, whereas 3D is actually present here. And what the thick brushwork here does, again, is it not only tells us that it's a painting. We can, from afar tell that, yeah, this is very clearly figurative. We can tell what the subject matter is. It's very believable. It's almost, in certain aspects, very realistic. You could say that, even. But from up close, we understand very clearly. And again, this is, everybody knows that this is painted. This is not what we tell ourselves, but it's what actually gives interest, what gives appeal to these images. We can not only see that it's painted, but we can glean the act of painting in the final product. I think this is sort of the final culmination of this quality that we've been talking about. The final culmination of detailed distribution and shape design and brushwork is that it shows the viewer not only the static image as a final, but also it implies how the image was made. We can almost feel that, yeah, this is a brushstroke that was left alone, and we can tell that it's painted here as one thing on top of the wash of a slightly darker color, for example. And I think the Leyendecker example is very good because we see directional brushwork, which is more standard, more conventional. This is something that you would expect. But here, I think what he's doing is, and in a lot of his other images, this is sort of the hallmark of his style in a lot of people's eyes, is that he is intentionally adding a pattern underneath the image. And that's a good way to actually phrase what we've been talking about. There is a pattern of flatness, a pattern of abstraction underneath the image, a meta sort of element. And here it's almost being exaggerated intentionally and kind of shoved in our face. It's like almost like a decorative element of this repetitive vertical hatching that certainly doesn't exist in reality, that I think is included in part to point towards the fact that, hey, this is actually a flat painting. And that's what makes it appealing, is that for Leyendecker specifically, he doesn't only handle shapes so well, but he also puts this underlying element of hatching that's in most people's minds so foreign to actually painting with a brush, painting in oil. So I think that's a very good example of just this quality that I've been talking about throughout the video. And then finally here we have something a little more conventional with a little bit of hatching still. It's almost always present in some areas, but then in others we can just tell that, yeah, this is, he took a brush, he put it into oil paint, and then he put it down, he left the mark, and he left the mark alone. And this is not something that we think about, especially perhaps as a layman that's not into painting, into the actual process of, and the fundamentals of illustration, but it's something that they understand, and I think it appeals universally. And finally, I think the sort of very last form, the very most exaggerated form of this, we can find more so in fine art, because it doesn't have these particular specific commercial constraints that illustration has, that all of these really examples that we've been looking at so far had. Where certain areas now, when seen up close, become truly abstract. Like for example here, if I just cropped out this bit of the image and I made it its own composition, let's say like this, it's an abstract composition, which you might find in like a contemporary art show or something like that. But it's, in the context of this figurative image, only one layer and only one part of the whole. And I think that's what makes it so appealing, is without constraints here, in this scenario, in this environment, the artist can actually fully express the reality of the painting being two-dimensional. And the range between abstraction and representation can become much broader, and range is really what creates interest, what creates contrast, what creates perhaps on some level here the appeal. It's this very interesting interplay of, you know, this is painted, this is quite, in some sense, quite realistically painted. It's simplified, it's stylized, but it's realistic. This is what a pants sleeve looks like. This is what a figure looks like. And then there's just blobs there. There's just abstraction here. This is very clearly a duck, but then there's just like a smear for the feathers. So you're rewarded for interacting with the image more closely, and in a sense that I've sort of already described, but even more so with this type of fine art, you're rewarded for also interacting with the image beyond the surface level, towards the more meta aspect, towards the more abstract visual quality. So I thought that was a good example. I thought all of these were good examples. I'm not sure that I thought that I did the best job explaining this the most coherently. So this was a little bit of a rambly video. I didn't plan it out too much. I didn't have too many notes for it. So hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully I didn't just sound like a rambling lunatic, and hopefully you have some thoughts of your own that you can share. Any kind of comment is welcome. I would appreciate even rage baiting comments. I think that would be funny, because it's an AI it's an AI discussion. It started as an AI discussion, so if you just pretend that you didn't watch the video and just leave a hateful AI loving comment or something like that, that would be great. If you have any thoughts about the actual topic discussed, I would like you to share those in the comments as well. If you have any other videos, any topic suggestions that you'd like me to cover, especially this kind of slop commentary content, or at least this is, you know, the format that I might try to pursue in the attempt to become internet famous, you know, and gain ad revenue. If you have that, you can message me with links or whatever. I think that would be good. Or you can leave a comment with a suggestion. So I'm sort of dragging the video on, but again, hopefully you got something out of this. It's sort of just the beginning of a broader discussion. And as I sort of alluded to in the beginning of the video, you can say, especially looking at this image as an example, as a very clear example of textual abstraction in mark making, you can't say that it's the last 10%, because it's sort of like the whole image is a big holistic entity, and it's built up as a whole, to where any mark that you make in the beginning will show through to some extent in the final. So, you know, there's no final 10%. That's more so a concept that's applicable to very formulaic commercial type of illustration. But the further you get away from that thinking, I think the more doors you unlock to actually a broader and a deeper understanding of image making, which I'm not claiming I necessarily have. So that's why I shared it in this rambling manner. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your attention. This has been Dr. Drawing, otherwise known as Professor Painting, and I will see you in the next video.